I just spent the last 3 days benchmarking the Radeon RX 7600 in 12 different games. Why did it take 3 days to benchmark 12 games, you may be asking? Hardware Unboxed does 40 game comparisons between multiple GPUs on a Tuesday afternoon. Well, the headset I'm using is the Quest 2, and as of right now, using a Quest 2 with a Radeon 7000 series GPU isn't quite as straightforward as one would hope. I know some of you watching this aren't going to care about the problems I ran into and are going to be sitting there saying, "Dude, shut up and get to the benchmarks already." And here's what I have to say to you. Nobody likes a whiner. The video's divided into chapters for a reason, so stop whining and just skip ahead. For the rest of you who want to know what playing VR with an RX 7600 is like right now with a Quest 2, here's what happened. After popping the 7600 into my test PC, I updated the Radeon Adrenaline driver to the most current driver, 23.8.1. When I launched Link, I immediately noticed the encode resolution was significantly lower than the render resolution I had set in the Oculus App. This wasn't exactly a surprise to me, because this is the same behavior I saw when using the 7900 XTX. When testing the 7900 XTX, I found the visuals were way better using Virtual Desktop than using Link, which led me to conclude it was Meta's software that was the problem and not AMD's drivers. So yeah, when I started up Link with the 7600, I wasn't surprised, but it was certainly disappointing to see that Meta still hasn't fixed Link performance with Radeon 7000 GPUs. This did not deter me from testing the 7600, however, and I started up Beat Saber and got a nice result. I then played some Contractors, and once again, got a nice result. I then fired up Pavlov, and that's when I got thrown a curveball. I first ran the game at 120 Hz, and it played fine for a little while, but after several minutes, the frame rate dropped out, and performance was terrible. Anyone with experience with PC gaming knows sometimes weird stuff like this happens and a game just needs to be restarted. So I did that, and it happened again. I then rebooted my PC to see if that would make a difference, but same thing. It was then I started going through the process of lowering the in-game settings, lowering the refresh rate, and lowering the render It was then I started going through the benchmarking process of lowering the in-game settings, lowering the refresh rate, and lowering the render resolution little by little. But the thing is, each time I'd make a change, Pavlov would run fine for a little bit, but after several minutes, then completely crap out. After hours of tweaking settings, I found it didn't matter what resolution I was running, it didn't matter what refresh rate I was running, and it didn't matter the settings I used in-game, I got the exact same behavior. My next thought was maybe it's the 8GB of VRAM causing the issue. But that didn't totally make sense to me, because I've tested other cards with only 8GB of VRAM and have never encountered this particular issue. They've had some of their own hiccups that have made me wonder if the 8GB of VRAM is the problem, but they've never run fine and then crapped out like this. And also, if it was the VRAM, as I lowered the resolution and other settings, I should have been seeing at least some kinds of improvements, but I wasn't seeing that at all. Anyway, at this point, I loaded up MSI Afterburner so I could more accurately monitor my system performance, and it did show VRAM usage was getting up near 8GB, but it also showed the frame buffer usage was only around 50%. Now, maybe I'm not understanding this correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, the VRAM usage in MSI Afterburner is just showing how much VRAM is being allocated at a given time, and the frame buffer usage is how much of that VRAM is actively being used. So if the 8GB of VRAM was the problem, then my understanding is the frame buffer usage should be maxed out, or at least like close to that. But since it wasn't maxed out, I don't think the 8GB of VRAM is the issue. My next thought was maybe it's the Oculus software causing the issue. So I tried playing Pavlov in Virtual Desktop, but once again, after playing for several minutes, performance tanked. I then decided it was time to try rolling back the driver to AMD's 23.7.1 driver, which I'd used with the 7900 XTX, and was finally able to play Pavlov without the frame rate completely dropping out. However, it only ran at 72 Hz, and we'll talk some more about that later. I then had to retest Beat Saber and Contractors, which ended up performing exactly the same as they had with the 23.8.1 driver, but when I started up The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, the weirdness I experienced with Pavlov returned.
Please, no! No! No!
I then spent several hours doing all the same troubleshooting I'd done with Pavlov. But this time when I finally made the switch to Virtual Desktop, the game ran normally. It was at this point I finally felt confident that much of the performance issues I'd been having were being caused by the Quest Link software. For those that are familiar with my VR GPU benchmarks, you know I typically use the Oculus Debug Tool's performance overlay to show the frame rate and how much performance headroom is still available. Well, for this video, I had to use Virtual Desktop for the majority of my testing because of all the problems I was having with Quest Link. Since Virtual Desktop's performance overlay doesn't show us how much performance headroom we have remaining, I used MSI Afterburner to monitor system performance, and as I go over each of the games I tested, I'm going to also share with you what the GPU usage was, as well as the VRAM and frame buffer usage, to help you get an idea of what exactly the 7600 is capable of. For those of you wondering, our GPU is the Gigabyte RX 7600 Gaming OC 8G, and as previously stated, I use the Adrenalin 23.7.1 driver. All testing was done on my Ryzen 7 5800X 3D test PC with 32GB of DDR4 3600MHz CL16 RAM and resizable bar enabled. Since Pavlov was the game that started off all of this, let's start there. After rolling back to the 23.7.1 driver, and after much troubleshooting and tweaking, I was able to get Pavlov to run smoothly using Quest Link at 4704 by 2384 at 72 Hz, using Pavlov's medium graphics quality settings. The performance headroom varied quite a bit depending on what was going on screen, but the lowest I saw it get was around 20% and the highest around 60%. The majority of the time it was between 40 and 50% at these settings. As for the other game that gave me trouble, The Walking Dead Saints and Sinners, I was never able to get it to run right with Quest Link, so I had to use Virtual Desktop for this one. The 7600 ran Saints and Sinners at 72 Hz on Virtual Desktop's high graphics quality setting, which, according to the chatbot in Virtual Desktop's Discord server, is a resolution of 2496 by 2592 per eye, for a total render resolution of 4992 by 2592. So, slightly higher than the render resolution I typically use with Quest Link. For the most part, I was able to max out Saints and Sinners graphics settings, except I did have to turn anti-aliasing down to medium. GPU usage in Afterburner was between 70 and 80%, frame buffer usage was between 40 and 50%, and VRAM usage topped out around 7.7 gigabytes. Beat Saber was one of only 2 games I was able to run at 120 Hz with the 7600. It was also one of the few games that ran fine using Quest Link. Using the settings listed on screen, you can see our performance headroom was in the neighborhood of 40 to 50%. But what I find interesting is looking at MSI Afterburner, I saw GPU usage was between 80 and 90%. So I'm not sure exactly how Oculus is calculating that performance headroom number. They're obviously looking at an aggregate of different system resources, and not just at the GPU. The one other game the 7600 was able to run at 120 Hz was Breachers. Using Virtual Desktop, I had some stuttering that wasn't exactly pleasant, but thankfully this game also ran just fine using Quest Link. Visually, this game looked much sharper when using Virtual Desktop, but ran more smoothly using Quest Link. As you can see, performance headroom was around 50% on the performance graph here, but like Beat Saber, when I checked the GPU usage in Afterburner, it was between 80 and 90%, with frame buffer usage between 50 and 60%, and VRAM usage at 5.5 gigabytes. Contractors was the last game I tested that ran well when using Quest Link, and the 7600 was able to run it at 90 Hz at 4704 by 2380, with a mixture of high and ultra settings and anti-aliasing at low. The 7600 was able to run Contractors at 120 Hz as well, at the expense of visual quality, but personally I prefer sharper visuals to the increased frame rate, which is why I went with 90 Hz instead. From here on out, we'll only be using virtual desktop, so here we go. Red Matter 2 is the one game I've identified that seems to run better on AMD GPUs than it does on NVIDIA GPUs, and it ran very nicely in virtual desktop at the high graphics quality setting at 90 Hz. The frame rate did drop by a few FPS at these settings when I did my laser scanning tool reflection test, but overall, performance was solid. Looking at our GPU usage, it fluctuated between 70 and 90%. Frame buffer usage was between 40 and 50%, and VRAM usage topped out at 5.9 gigabytes. The 7600 also ran Blade and Sorcery on the high graphics quality setting in virtual desktop, but in order to set the render resolution that high, I did have to turn the refresh rate down to 72 Hz. While the game ran fine most of the time at these settings, I did see the frame rate take a hit pretty regularly when engaging with NPCs. It didn't ruin the experience, but maintaining a smooth frame rate throughout is certainly preferable. Looking at our stats in Afterburner, GPU usage was typically at 70%, but did spike up to around 80% at times. Frame buffer usage was between 30 and 40%, and VRAM usage was around 6.3 gigabytes. Despite not being at max settings, the RX 7600 did deliver a very good and enjoyable experience in Life Alyx. I did have to set the refresh rate to 72 Hz, but I was able to use Virtual Desktop's high graphics quality setting and the high fidelity performance option in Alyx, so the game looked great. As for our GPU usage, we were at a pretty constant 90%. VRAM usage was between 4.4 and 4.5 gigabytes, and the frame buffer ranged between 40 and 50%. While we were pretty close to the edge of what the 7600 can do in this game, I feel I found a pretty good balance of performance and visuals as the game played perfectly and looked amazing. Another game with amazing visuals is Lone Echo 2, and the 7600 performed better in this title than I thought it would. When testing this game with other GPUs with similar performance to the 7600, I've had to set the game settings to low and lower the render resolution to where things don't look as good as I'd like to get a playable experience. Once again, I had to set the refresh rate to 72 Hz for this, but the 7600 was able to run Lone Echo 2 at Virtual Desktop's high graphics quality setting, which uses a render resolution of 4992 by 2592. That, coupled with the medium graphics quality setting in Lone Echo 2, left the game looking pretty good. Not great, mind you, but good. Into the Radius is a game I've only recently begun benchmarking, and I haven't been able to spend a lot of time with it, so I'm only just getting started in this one. That being said, for the hour or so I did spend playing it with the 7600, I was able to dial in a playable experience at 72 Hz using Virtual Desktop's medium graphics quality setting, which uses a render resolution of 4032 by 2112. I say a playable experience because things weren't always smooth. Looking at the GPU usage, Afterburner showed we were only around 70%, so I kind of feel like game performance should have been better than what I got. Frame buffer usage was between 20 and 30%, but memory usage was at 7.9 gigabytes, so maybe that played into it? I don't know for sure. I have read some stuff online that Into the Radius is more CPU demanding than most VR games typically are, but I wasn't noting my CPU performance during my tests, so I can't verify that. This is a GPU review after all, and not a CPU review, but anyway, note to self for next time. Like most of the games I tested the RX 7600 with, Assetto Corsa Competizione also ran well at 72 Hz at 4032 by 2112, using the in-game settings listed on screen. This put our GPU usage between 80 and 90%, with the frame buffer usage around 40%, and VRAM usage at 7.9 gigabytes. I don't claim to be a sim racer, and I'm sure those of you who are can tell by watching my driving that I don't have much experience doing any kind of racing at all, so I don't know what you guys would consider acceptable performance in this game, but I felt the 7600 delivered an acceptable VR experience in this game at the settings that I used. Now for the final game in our 12-game suite, Microsoft Flight Simulator. In the past, I've always tried to dial settings in to at least hit 72 FPS in this training flight over Sedona, Arizona. For lower-end cards, this always meant I was turning the render resolution down, where the graphics looked blocky and blurry. This time around, though, I wanted to try keeping the render resolution as high as possible and keep the frame rate above 32 FPS. While this is a pretty low frame rate for VR, every VR pilot out there knows that as long as your frame times are consistent, a lower frame rate like this in Flight Simulator is actually not too bad. Like always, I set all of Flight Simulator settings to their lowest values, except for render scaling, world scale, level of terrain detail, and objects level of detail, which I always set to 100. As you can see, with the graphics quality in Virtual Desktop set to medium, we were averaging a frame rate in the mid-50s in this flight. Switching over to New York City, the frame rate hung in better than I thought it would, only dropping a few FPS to the low 50s to high 40s. Looking at the GPU usage, it was no surprise we were pegged at 100% the entire time in both flights. Frame buffer usage, however, was at around 40%, and VRAM usage at 7.9 gigabytes. Assuming my understanding of VRAM usage and frame buffer usage is correct, it appears I've been wrong in past videos when I've attributed performance issues to those cards only having 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And again, please, any of you watching this, if you know for certain what the difference is in Afterburner between VRAM usage and frame buffer usage, please let me know, and if I'm way off on my interpretation of the data I've collected. I do plan to do more research into this, and next time I'll let you know what I've learned. But until then, if you're curious about the VR performance of other GPUs, check out my Can It VR playlist here, where you can see the VR performance of different GPUs ranging from the GTX 1650 and RX 580 all the way up to the 7900 XTX and the RTX 4080. Subscribe!